Good morning, everyone. This is Mark Nykirk from NKU's Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement, one of the partners in the Northern Kentucky Forum, along with the 3 public library districts in Northern Kentucky and Boone, Kenton, and Campbell County. Delighted to have you this morning, and I will tell you that we honestly did schedule this particular forum back when the possibility of being together and having coffee and bagels for you was a realistic possibility. We also thought we would be doing it in May, a couple of days after the May primary, but these are extraordinary times. So here we are in the virtual world and talking about a primary that was in June rather than in May. But one day we'll be back together, and looking forward to that. We're scheduling future forums now. We have one in July. We haven't settled on the exact date yet, but we'll be looking at how COVID-19 is affecting the public schools and the return to schools. So look forward to information on that, and be happy to be with you again for that forum. This morning we welcome back to the Northern Kentucky Forum Al Cross, who is the director of the Institute for Rural Journalism at the University of Kentucky, where he is also a professor of journalism. The Institute is a national service that spotlights news stories that are of particular importance to rural communities, and it's part of an effort to elevate the conversation and news and information about communities in rural America. And so there's a daily blog if you're not signed up for it. Today'd be a good day to do that, and I'm sure Al can tell you more about how to do that. You also know Al from his appearances on KET. He was there Tuesday evening as the polls closed. Has been there for a number of years as a analyst and also as a columnist. You have probably read him in the Courier Journal and now locally in the Northern Kentucky Tribune, which is his home base now, although the column continues to appear in the Courier Journal and other newspapers as a political, analyzing the political scene in Kentucky. So one quick note about how this goes. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A function. At any point, type a question in there. We will monitor those and get to those in the latter part of the presentation. But first, Al will kind of take us through what we know and what we don't know after we've had a primary election, and if this tells us anything about what's ahead for us in November. So Al Cross, welcome to the forum.
Well, glad to be with you. This is certainly an unusual piece of business, and plenty to talk about. I think these sessions usually work best when we get a good Q&A and back and forth, so I'll look forward to your questions. Just to review what happened, the history of mankind shows that pandemics have had a big impact, and the pandemic certainly had a big impact on this election. If the primary had been held on May 19th as scheduled, we would be talking today about Amy McGrath versus Mitch McConnell. But about 9 to 12 days after the primary would have been held, things blew up with George Floyd and renewed protest over Breonna Taylor in Louisville. And Charles Booker, state representative from Louisville, first term African-American, 35 years old, caught a wave in a way that few politicians ever do. He caught lightning in a bottle, to use another sort of tired metaphor, but it's really true in this case. People were mobilized by the sense that racial injustice has persisted in society and that it's time to do something about it. And Booker was almost the ideal tribune for this because he grew up in the poorest zip code in Kentucky, as he likes to remind people. Grew up hard, but brought himself up and has achieved both professional and political success. And he's an excellent speaker, comes across as being authentic, and he rode the wave. Amy McGrath, meanwhile, was busy campaigning against Mitch McConnell and did not expect to spend a lot of money in the primary. But Booker began to gain traction, and she had to switch her strategy. And it really didn't completely switch. To me, one of the more telling moments in the primary was when she was on a call with her supporters in Western Kentucky one night last week. I was allowed in on the call because she wasn't doing events at the time. And one caller asked her about Confederate monuments. And she didn't give a general answer. She said she was for evicting Jeff Davis from the state capitol, which had been done, and that there needed some adjustments made, and things like criminal justice and so on. Adjustments, not changes. And I think a lot of people voting in the primary would say, we don't need no sticking adjustments. We want change. That was not the kind of message you need for a primary, but it reflected the message that she has had from the start, because she knows she has no chance at all unless she persuades some people who have voted and will vote for Donald Trump to vote with her and against Mitch McConnell. And that requires a very narrow, middle of the road approach. And she's still wedded to that, or was at the time. It was interesting in the interview she had on KET election night. She was probably more forceful, direct, engaging, and clear than I have seen her during this race. And other people had the same observation. If that sort of Amy McGrath, instead of the consultant-built ads, had been dominating the conversation, Booker might not have gotten so much traction. So then the question becomes, who's winning? This is sort of like a high school basketball game, and we're having a first quarter wrap-up. We've got about 10 to 12% of the expected vote in. Most counties are not really reporting anything. The state law says you have to report results at the polling place. You just have to post them. You don't necessarily have to put them out publicly. And I suppose some of the state's newspapers will go around and get those numbers. But I think a lot of people are just inclined to sit back and wait until Tuesday, June 30th for the results. I'm going to try to share a screen here and give you some idea of where we stand. This is a page from the New York Times. These are Associated Press results. The Washington Post has a little bit a different set of results. The numbers are essentially the same. And they reflect the polling that we saw before the election among people who had already voted. And I think what Booker has to count on here in order to win is a huge turnout on election day in Louisville and Lexington. He's surely going to carry Jefferson County by a big margin. He won the Fayette County vote like some 72 to 12 or some crazy number, 72 to 23 maybe. And we just don't know how that vote is going to run. The theory of the race is that in the 3 weeks of absentee voting, you probably had 15% of the people vote, and it was overwhelmingly McGrath. In the second week, it would have been picking up for Booker. The Booker people would like to think that they caught her in the second week. I kind of doubt that. I think they surely did catch her in the third week. And you just don't know when people actually scratched their ballot, when they filled it out. They could have filled it out several days before they actually mailed it. You know, I didn't mail mine until about 2 days after I filled it out. So we're operating in a case of first impression here. We don't really have any good hard facts and data. I think what we can say is that McGrath has the early edge, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. What I told somebody on election night is that it looks better for Booker at this point than it ever has, but it doesn't mean he will win. If you look at some of these counties, you see some surprising results, or it might initially be surprising. Here's Hart County. Booker wins the walk-ins. He also wins Barron, Allen, Warren, home of Bowling Green, big vote there. Logan, Todd. He also won Christian, although it doesn't show up on this map. These are all counties with anywhere from meaningful to significant African-American populations. And the anecdotal evidence is that the walk-in vote was primarily or disproportionately young and African-American. people who have a history of lower turnout. This all brought to mind something that John Holloway of the Midway City Council said at their meeting on the 1st of June, the day before the filing day for those offices. He wasn't going to run again, and he wanted to see more people of color run. And he said that one of his neighbors had been overheard to say, one of his black neighbors said, voting's for white people. And what that did was reflect a long-standing attitude among a lot of African Americans that in this state, their votes really don't matter. They're too much of a minority. They're never going to be listened to. I think you can also translate that to young people. And this whole idea that voting's for other kinds of people did not hold on primary day, because we had a huge turnout among young and African-American voters. And that is where Charles Booker could still win this race. Do we have any questions yet? I'm going to stop sharing the screen and take a look at the chat.
No questions yet.
Okay. Just to look at some numbers, we had 161,000 people voted in person. About 880,000 absentee ballots were issued. Generally, about 10% of absentee ballots are not returned, so we're probably looking at a little under 800,000. So about 1/6 of the vote is going to be cast in person. And it means we have actually more than 3/4 to go. We have 5/6 to go. Although I will go back to the screen and make a point about what we've seen so far. You look at the race by the size of lead. McGrath is in purple, Booker in green. You see more circles and larger circles generally for McGrath. Some counties have reported complete results like Bath and Montgomery. Now these are counties where she ran in the House race in 2018, where people already know her. Likewise, Woodford, it doesn't show up on this map, but she won Woodford with a little over half the vote, which was a pretty good performance, I think. She also won Davis and Hopkins, two very significant counties in western Kentucky. Carter County up east. If you look at northern, though, Booker had a really big election day turnout, it seems. Kenton County is Amy McGrath's native county, but Booker carried the walk-ins. I think McGrath is still expecting to carry the county as a whole, but those numbers do show the strength of Booker's election day voting. Looking at Campbell, we see McGrath winning, and also in Boone, and likewise in Owen and Trimble. No results from Carroll or Gallatin. Interestingly enough, the Secretary of State told me that the State Board of Elections did not want to release any results at all until all results were reported a week later. And they forgot about a state law which requires these results to be posted at each polling place. So that is why we have the walk-in votes being reported by a lot of counties in a very public way. They're publicly available in every county at whatever polling places they had, but they haven't been reported to some of these news or vote gathering organizations. Mark,
there is we did a question, if you want to pause. Sure. For this, and sure. Just sort of any analysis on who would have the stronger chance against McConnell, McGrath, or Booker, or what, and how would those, maybe you could walk through how those races might be different depending on which candidate it is.
Right. Let me get a quick drink. Now, the easy answer to that is it was a good day for Mitch McConnell, because if McGrath wins the primary, she has spent more than half her money. She's battered. She's not highly regarded by a significant part of the party base. She has to work on building up the base while undergoing more attacks from McConnell. Just doesn't look good for her. With Booker, Just to be frank, the idea that a conservative, rural-oriented state would elect an African-American liberal from Louisville to the United States Senate just doesn't quite parse politically. But I like to go back to what I said the night Donald Trump was elected. Now almost anything can happen. We live in a very volatile political environment. There is a high level of dissatisfaction with the political system. And that is what makes Mitch McConnell vulnerable. It's hard to imagine Booker beating him, but in this particular environment, you just can't rule out about anything. And there's a magic in a candidate inspiring people. And I think it's clear that Booker's appeal goes beyond young voters and African Americans. I think it goes to a larger vote. It's hard to see him persuading people who voted for Donald Trump to vote for him, but we'll just leave that open for how it plays out. My guess is that McGrath has the slight edge to win this primary at this point, but her path to victory is even more difficult than it was before Booker made his surge. Any other questions?
If I could follow up real quick on that, just how would the two candidates do one-on-one with McConnell? And what I'm thinking is McConnell has practiced in debate almost naturally, but also through years of being in politics. And two McGrath things, you mentioned one of them, but also in the KET debate where she was asked whether she was participating in the protest, became an ad for Booker. Yeah. And adjustments. These things make you wonder about replies, immediate replies in the heat of battle, if you will. So if you're in a debate stage with McConnell, how's that going to go? On the other hand, you mentioned that she was looser on election night.
Well, that was a recorded bit that she did with Renee Shaw before the actual returns came in. I think that you put McGrath up against McConnell on a debate platform, and she could handle herself all right. I mean, she has been studying how to run against Mitch McConnell for a year or more. Her difficulty has been trying to negotiate that path as she tries to get through a primary. Booker is a little bit harder to guess, but he's more nimble of tongue than McGrath is. And I think he comes across as being more authentic, frankly. And that has an appeal to people. So you'd have to give McConnell the edge, certainly, but either challenger would have certain cards to play. Somebody asked, well, they say that the Booker and McGrath campaigns provided pizza, chicken wings, and ponchos to voters waiting to vote in Lexington and Louisville. Did they do anything for voters in Northern Kentucky? Is that legal? They may have done something up there. Both of them had pretty good ground operations. There is a legal question because, as Joe Girth of the Courier-Journal wrote in his column published in print today, state official in Jefferson County, Reggie Meeks, state representative, lost his seat because he took chicken wings and pizza to people at the polls many years ago. And you're not supposed to give anything of value to voters, even if it doesn't involve a quid pro quo. I'll give you this if you vote for me. And as Joe pointed out, that's probably gone right in Mitch McConnell's opposition research folder, and we probably haven't heard the last of it. Frankly, though, I think voters care about a lot more important things than chicken wings and pizza.
You talk a little bit about this transition to vote at home and how that went, what we might expect in November.
Yeah. One of the big problems with this election was the compressed time frame to prepare for it. The principal reason for just having one polling place in a county was that most poll workers are older people who are more susceptible to the virus. And it's difficult to recruit poll workers. And the clerks kind of threw up their hands and said, we just can't do this. Now they have more time to recruit. And I think they ought to take advantage of this renewed interest by younger people and people of color in the political process. There's a pretty good pool out there of potential poll workers who are not so vulnerable to the virus. And I think it would be a good idea to have more polling locations. You'll have a higher turnout in a presidential election than you will in a party primary by far. You're going to need more locations. I do think we will have to still have primarily absentee voting because we're not going to have a vaccine for this virus. And we're going to be approaching a time when viruses get stronger as the weather gets cooler. And there's possibility of co-infections with the flu and the coronavirus. So I think we're going to have the same type of election largely, but with more in-person polling places. Somebody's asked me about the Republican primary in the 4th District. I must plead guilty to not having paid much attention to it because I could see that Todd McMurtry was not getting any traction. Some national stories said Republicans who opposed Trump won primaries and included Massey in that, which was just an almost complete misrepresentation. Massey votes with Trump most of the time. Sure, Trump had a tweet criticizing Massey's action on the CARES Act, but Trump supporters have learned not to take him literally. They take him figuratively, not literally. And his critics take him just the other way. And that's one reason a lot of his critics don't quite understand Donald Trump and the appeal of that he has to a lot of Americans. So to classify Massey as a anti-Trumper on the basis of one tweet is just reaching for a point that doesn't exist. I think the pandemic made it very difficult for McMurtry to get traction. Any challenger has to go out and meet people one-on-one, small groups, raise money, work up some interest, and that just did not happen. I thought he had a pretty good shot before the pandemic hit, at least at giving Massey a good race, but with the inability to engage with folks directly, it was almost impossible.
Walk us through some of the other congressional, what's the rest of the congressional landscape look like in Kentucky?
Well, the only really contested primary, other contested primary was in the 6th. It looks like Josh Hicks, a Lexington lawyer, is going to win that over Daniel Kempf. And that's for the seat of Andy Barr, who beat Amy McGrath by about 3 points last time. Congressman Barr lost his wife in a very tragic occurrence last week, and Hicks actually suspended campaigning out of respect for him. With Trump on the ballot and there being a larger turnout and not a whole lot of money on Hicks's side like McGrath had last time, it's difficult to imagine Hicks beating Barr, but you will see some stuff about that race. The other congressionals really don't have a whole lot of action. There are some interesting state legislative races. The Republicans are a little bit concerned about Chris McDaniel and his challenge from Ryan Alexia. But they're not anywhere near losing their supermajority in the Senate. The question is, can they hang on to their supermajority in the House? They would have to lose 3 seats to do that. And with Trump on the ballot, it's difficult at this point to imagine. We have seen some erosion in Trump's support, but I think it's just around the fringes. I think he has a larger core of support in this state than he does in most states, and it's going to be very difficult to erode.
Would you talk a bit about what is Trump's appeal to Kentuckians?
Well, Trump essentially ran an anti-elite campaign. He campaigned against the system. And there is not a high degree of faith in the political system in this state. People have become inured to corruption, self-dealing, and they just don't have a very high level of expectation for their politicians. And Donald Trump appealed to that. He also essentially cut a bargain with the evangelical wing of the Republican Party that he was going to be the guy who put anti-abortion judges on the courts. And that really was what elected him, I think. There were real concerns about his morals and character, and the evangelicals made what some would call a deal with the devil to get what they want out of the political system. And I think that brought comfort to a lot of people who had misgivings about Trump personally. So I think that's essentially the appeal of Trump in this state. We have a question from Kelsey. Do you think there's ever a scenario where Northern Kentucky, especially the college area, has different results than the majority of the state? It seems like college towns vote more Democratic. Yes, they do. And that's part of the reason that you see for a good vote for Booker and Lexington and Bowling Green, some other college towns, Danville. But still a lot of suitcase students at these colleges who remain registered to vote in their home counties. And I'm not sure it has all that great an impact. I think in this election, we're going to see more of an impact of younger voters than ever because they really identified with Booker. And it'll be interesting to watch the precinct. Actually, can't have a precinct result because of the way they did it. But when you get the turnout report in, I guess July or August, I think we'll see a much higher than usual turnout by younger voters. They do report turnout by age. They don't report it by race anymore, but they do by age.
What about in the going back to the Senate race? What will happen from a money standpoint? It looked obviously with Northern Kentucky, we are not used to seeing primary ads on our television, and you know the mechanics of that with the Cincinnati market. But we saw them this time from both Booker and McGrath. I'm not sure, probably more McGrath than Booker, but money was.
He got on late. People in the Nashville market also saw ads from Amy McGrath, and I can't remember the last time a statewide Democratic nominee ran a full schedule of ads in Nashville. It's just a really expensive market, more expensive than Cincinnati now. And McGrath was able to do that because she had raised over $41 million. But now she's spent over $21 million. And I think the national support for McGrath has largely come in individual contributions that she and the Democratic Party have ginned up because she's running against McConnell. And if she comes out of this primary looking weak and unable to beat McConnell, there's plenty of other places that Democrats can put their money. So it's going to be up to her to keep that national fundraising base alive. So that's another challenge that she faces. If Booker were to be the nominee, he would attract a great deal of anti-McConnell money, just like McGrath has. But again, there's lots of other places to put money. And if you pair up Charles Booker and Mitch McConnell, you know, the initial poll is probably going to be 60-40. And that is not going to be an enticing prospect for people who want to give money.
Just a reminder, if you have a question, use the Q&A or chat. We're watching both places. Whichever you get to first is fine. So just type your question in there. We'll go a little bit longer. Al, what about Governor Beshear? Has the pandemic been a net plus or minus for him, or do we know yet?
A big plus. Here he is as effectively a minority governor, Republican legislature, faces a huge challenge and appears to have addressed it in a way that has pleased most of the public. The Republicans are trying to pick away at some weak spots. Yesterday, Damon Thayer had some comment about contact tracing being a threat to freedom and privacy. Well, that's completely out of bounds. Contact tracing has been done for decades in this state. But I think the Republicans are concerned that Beshear has made a very good first impression. And it really is his first impression. Sure, he ran against Matt Bevin. Sure, he ran in the primary, but he's now being judged against himself. And that is the toughest judgment. And so far, the indications are that he's passed that test. And Kentucky's a funny place because it is served by so many television markets that are based outside the state. Your all's market being the best example of that. Kentuckians don't really have a good handle on their governors. Burton Jones was a very popular governor, but 1 year into his term, they took a poll and 22% of the people couldn't name the governor, and his name was Jones. There's just too much news from other places and not enough focus on Kentucky for Kentuckians to have a real good handle on governors, and that's why this first impression, the first real impression that Beshear is making on people is very important. I think Republicans believed that he'd be easy pickings in 2023. That is less so now. It's going to be very difficult to predict what happens in 3 years, but he looks like he's in a better spot. That being said, his big challenge is still before him. And one of the biggest challenges was addressed yesterday, and that is the opening of school. Making students wear masks at the bus stop, getting on the bus, keeping their masks on the bus, keeping their masks on in class, which they will have to do in most classrooms because they're not big enough, is going to be a problem. The wearing of masks has been politicized. Mark had a good column for us on Kentucky Health News, adapted from a Facebook post he made about some guy who came to his house to do some work and just wanted to argue about masks and the pandemic. There was an interesting poll, though, national poll this week that showed most Trump supporters believe that wearing masks thwarts the spread of the virus. About 60%. You wish it was more, but it does tend to show how the thing's been politicized. Beshear tried to take a lower profile with this yesterday, having the interim education commissioner and the lieutenant governor do most of the talking, but he's where the buck stops. And if there's a lot of controversy and turmoil, people are going to blame it on him. And that's why his big challenge is still before him. You also have the possibility that we could have a resurgence of the virus. There's a problem in Cincinnati right now, and they're going to do more testing in Northern Kentucky next week because of that. The infection rate in Ohio and Kentucky is about the same. It's just under 1. Just to explain that, an infection rate of under 1 means that for 100 people who are infected, fewer than 100 others are being infected by them. The hot spots in the country, like Myrtle Beach, have a rate of 1.52, where every 100 people are affecting 152. if we get into a spot where the rate gets above 1.1, as it probably is in Cincinnati, I haven't looked at that number, then they may have to pull back on some of the planned reopenings. We may not be able to have restaurants at full capacity and things like that. I think, though, that the reopening has gotten so much momentum, and people are becoming so accustomed to life somewhat as it used to be, that any kind of hold up and pullback would be highly controversial. And I think Beshear knows that. This whole exercise has been, he says that politics doesn't matter to him, that he's over politics. I just don't believe that. Governors always have to be sensitive to politics, even if he may not be referring to the 2023 election, but he's an elected representative. He is supposed to be conscious and respectful of the responsible views of voters. And he's been a little more careful than most governors in reopening the state. And I think that's generally been a good thing. If you look at the infection rates around us, Kentucky is better off. It's not been that good for the economy, but it boils down to a question of what you put your priority on, saving lives or having an economy. And that is a very difficult decision. And I think people do realize that these are difficult questions, and they have some sympathy for Beshear. They're willing to cut him a lot of slack. But once they see that he's being too political or not strong enough, then that support may erode.
We have a question that'll take us back to mail-in voting, but before we go to that, let me just stay on Beshear and the state for a moment. It's for as long as I can recall, kind of a sport whenever a General Assembly session is coming up to say how big the projected deficit is and that we're in a crisis. Looking back over the years, that seems to be true even in years when we were in fairly fiscally sound situation, but we still panic about it. Here we have the actual threat of decreased revenue and cuts and I guess a biennial budget, a 2-year budget that's going to have to get a revisited after a year. That could be tough sailing for Beshear. Of course, it's not so easy for the Senate and the House either, but I just wonder how you see that playing out as we move toward January and the projections and how a Republican House and Senate will work with a Democratic governor on that very difficult issue.
Well, it's difficult to see, and a lot of it depends on how much money we get from the federal government. I think the next relief bill will have some general relief for states and localities that will help them with their budgets to make up for the economic losses that cause the revenue losses. But I don't think it's going to be as much as they would like. And state government will have to be cut even further. It's difficult to see Beshear asking for a tax increase in these circumstances. He might try for cigarette tax increase, which would get you a little money. And there's a new health argument for that, by the way. If you smoke, you're more susceptible to viral infection, including this one. So the time would seem to be ripe for that. But tobacco issues are always difficult. It's pretty imponderable what's going to happen because so much depends on what we get from the feds. Anything else?
Al, this question, what's your preliminary assessment of how Kentucky managed the primary? Will there be communication and processes refined to encourage mail-in and early voting, as there will be in other states like Ohio? And not much time to get this together for November.
Yeah, I think they did a good job considering the limited time they had available. As I said earlier, I think we need more polling locations, and they should be able to do that because they've got more time to recruit poll workers. And they ought to take advantage of this renewed interest from people of color and younger people in the system. Try to recruit some of them to be poll workers. That would pay long-term dividends because, you know, once you're a poll worker, you kind of like to do that every year. It's if you like it. Some people try and don't like it, but it's a really good form of public service. And I think that they now have time to do that, and we should have a quite manageable election in November.
The staying on that, there were in the national press leading up to Tuesday some commentary about how voter suppression as it relates to Kentucky, and particularly I think the things that I heard were focused on Jefferson County, 600,000 voters, one polling place. Not a lot of discussion about the effort of the mail-in voting.
Right.
But there are, you know, swirling underneath all this, so to some extent, it seemed to me that we were just trying to manage an election with a lot of new components, and we didn't have a full discussion of are there voter suppression issues here? If you're mailing things to people's home to remind them that it's easy to vote by mail, are you reaching everybody? Will there be a purge of the election rolls that impact some demographics differently from others? What are the implications on voter suppression, I guess, is the overall question.
Well, I'll address the national commentary first. National commentary was playing off what happened in Georgia the week before. Georgia was a disaster, very poorly managed. Kentucky and Georgia usually have their primaries on the same day. They could only move theirs up 4 weeks, and ours was 5. So we followed them immediately, and you know, it was the most handy comparison that national reporters had. And some of them made too much of it. And then it blew up on social media. And I suspect that the Booker campaign encouraged that. They wanted to get the best possible turnout on election day. They wanted to make people mad and get to the polls. And it may have worked. I don't think there's any real systematic voter suppression in this state, but we have a voting structure that is not all that friendly. You know, we still close the polls at 6 p.m., which I think may be a leftover from the law that said bars can't be open while the polls are open. And bars wanted to open at 6, and so they do the switch. Well, now bars can be open during elections, and we ought to have later polling closures. We ought to go to 7 or 8 o'clock. Maybe start a little later because, you know, 12 hours is a pretty long shift for a poll worker. But we need to make it even easier to vote. There is concern among some quarters about the possibility of increased fraud through absentee voting. And in a lot of counties in this state, we do have a problem with people who sell their absentee votes. You know, the fixer arranges for the request of the ballot and makes sure the ballot's filled out the right way and gets it in, and money changes hands. But that is real easy to find if you do it very much. And the concern that's been expressed at the national level by some people who ought to know better is just completely off base. It's impossible, I think, to have a vast fraud of absentee voting. We're always going to have the problem of people who will sell their votes to people they know. But once it gets beyond the neighborhood and the small county, it gets spotted and it gets prosecuted, as was shown in North Carolina recently. And I'm sorry I lost my track, but return me back to what the basic question was.
No, you're fine on the question, but I'll follow up if you don't mind. And remind everybody, we're about to wrap up, so if you have a question, please put it in the chat or the Q&A. In putting this election together, with sort of a vote-at-home strategy, it seemed to me to be fairly bipartisan and not contentious, but we're also dealing with a closed primary, so I really if I'm a Democrat, I can't disrupt the Republican election. The mechanics of that changes in November. Will we still have a two-party consensus on how to proceed in November, or can we expect some serious debate about how we're going to vote in November?
You know, my gut on that tells me that there's not going to be much serious debate because what they did worked. You know, why try to fix something that's not really broken? You know, they made a fix, they made a patch. They're getting by with what they did. I think everybody knows we need more polling places. The Secretary of State was very much for more polling places. It was the clerks that were the problem because they were going to have difficulty recruiting poll workers. And they need to start working on that right away so that we don't have any problems in November. But it's hard for me to see much debate about it. You know, the president is trying to make people think that all this mail-in vote is going to make the election corrupt. You know, before the 2016 election, he didn't think he was going to win, and he made noises about it being corrupt and rigged. And now he sees himself down by double digits in the polls, and he's saying the same things. You know, wants to shift the blame from himself to the system. He always runs against the system. You can count on that.
Well, Al, tune your ear in. That's the audience giving you applause and saying thank you for being with us today. And I encourage everyone watching to follow us at nkyforum.org and on Facebook as you see more community conversations upcoming, and we'll look forward to the day when we'll be back together. Now we hope to have you up and buy you a cup of coffee.
Well, Mark, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. And just as a brief plug, I'll show you my publications that people might want to take a look at. This is Kentucky Health News, which is funded by the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky. This is the Midway Messenger, which my students and I published for the lovely little town of Midway. And here is the Rural Blog, which is our national publication. All these are easy to find online, and we try to help not just rural journalists do their jobs out there, but we try to inform the public conversation. And I'm glad to be with you folks and hope to visit in person next time.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, audience, and we'll be back together soon.
Bye-bye.